A respected pastor in a small American town is found dead under mysterious circumstances. The investigation uncovers a love triangle involving two young members of his congregation. Who is behind this cruel act? Subscribe to the channel and follow every detail of this shocking case. In the heart of a quiet, picturesque town nestled deep in the American countryside, life moved at a steady, predictable pace. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, where the local diner served as the hub of gossip, and where Sundays were sacred, dedicated to the community church. The church, a modest but beautiful building with a towering steeple, stood at the center of the town's social and spiritual life. Its walls echoed with the hymns of the faithful, and its pews were filled with the same families, generation after generation. At the helm of this spiritual sanctuary was Pastor Daniel Brooks, a man whose very presence commanded respect and admiration. Pastor Daniel was more than just a spiritual leader. He was the moral compass of the town. His sermons were not merely spoken words, but heartfelt messages that resonated deeply with his congregation. His voice, steady and warm, had a way of soothing troubled souls and inspiring hope in the darkest of times. He was a man of deep conviction, unwavering faith, and boundless compassion, qualities that made him beloved by all who knew him. His reputation extended beyond the church walls, as he was often seen helping those in need, offering counsel to the troubled, and leading community efforts to aid the less fortunate. In every sense, Daniel Brooks was the embodiment of what a pastor should be. Daniel's wife, Sarah, was a steadfast partner in both life and ministry. Together, they were the perfect team. Sarah was as dedicated to the church as Daniel, often seen organizing events, leading prayer groups, and offering a kind word to anyone who crossed her path. Her gentle demeanor and nurturing spirit made her a beloved figure among the churchgoers. She was the glue that held the congregation together, always ready with a smile or a comforting hug. Sarah's unwavering support for her husband and her deep involvement in the church's activities only added to the couple's image as the ideal spiritual leaders. Among the congregation, two young men stood out for their exceptional dedication and involvement. Ethan and Lucas. Both were in their early 20s, and both had grown up in the church under Daniel's guidance. Ethan was the more outgoing of the two, with a natural charisma that drew people to him. He was often at the forefront of church activities, leading youth groups, organizing community service projects, and bringing an infectious energy to everything he did. His extroverted personality and easy smile made him popular among his peers and a favorite of the congregation. Lucas, on the other hand, was more reserved, introspective, and thoughtful. He was often found in quiet corners, deep in prayer or reflection. Where Ethan was a spark of excitement, Lucas was a calm, steady flame. He had a deep, contemplative nature that resonated with those who sought a deeper understanding of their faith. His quiet wisdom and gentle spirit made him a trusted confidant, particularly among those who were struggling with personal issues. Lucas's relationship with Pastor Daniel was particularly close, as the pastor saw in him a kindred spirit, someone who could potentially take up the mantle of leadership in the future. Daniel, recognizing the potential in both young men, began to mentor them more closely. He often invited Ethan and Lucas for private meetings at the church, where they would discuss matters of faith, personal struggles, and the challenges of living a life devoted to God. These sessions were meant to deepen their spiritual understanding and prepare them for greater roles within the church. The close relationship between Daniel and the two young men did not go unnoticed by the congregation. Some viewed it as a natural extension of Daniel's mentorship, a sign that he was nurturing the next generation of church leaders. Others, however, began to whisper. As time went on, the bond between Daniel, Ethan, and Lucas became a topic of quiet speculation. In a town where little went unnoticed, the frequent private meetings raised eyebrows. People began to wonder what exactly was being discussed behind closed doors. Rumors started to circulate, subtle at first, but growing in intensity. Some questioned the nature of the relationship between the pastor and the two young men. Was it simply mentorship, or was there something more? The whispers spread, fueled by a mix of curiosity and concern, and a subtle tension began to weave its way through the congregation. Despite the murmurs, nothing seemed overtly out of place. The church services continued as usual, with Daniel delivering his sermons with the same fervor and conviction as always. Ethan and Lucas remained active in their roles, seemingly unfazed by the gossip swirling around them. Yet, beneath the surface, the dynamics within the church were shifting. The once unshakable trust in Pastor Daniel's judgment was being quietly questioned, and the close-knit community began to feel the strain of unspoken suspicions. The tension was palpable, though unacknowledged, like a shadow that loomed over the church. People continued to attend services, smile politely, and go through the motions of their daily lives. But the sense of unity that had once defined the congregation was fraying at the edges. The once warm and welcoming atmosphere of the church was now tinged with unease. And while the pastor, his wife, and the two young men carried on with their duties, a sense of foreboding hung in the air, as if something was brewing just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. As the whispers grew louder and more insistent, the town's perfect facade began to crack. The questions that had been quietly asked in private conversations were now being voiced more openly, albeit still in hushed tones. What exactly was the nature of the relationship between the pastor, Ethan, and Lucas? Was it a simple matter of mentorship, or was there a deeper, more complicated truth that was yet to be uncovered? The answers to these questions would soon come to light, but not before the town was plunged into a scandal that would forever alter the course of its history. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and as they took root, they would grow into something far more sinister, leading to a revelation that would shock the entire community. For now, though, the town remained on the edge, teetering between the peace of the past and the storm that was about to break. One fateful morning, the peaceful town awoke to the news that would shatter its serene facade. Pastor Daniel Brooks, the man who had been the spiritual anchor of the community, was found dead in his office at the church. The discovery was made by Sarah, his devoted wife, who had come looking for him after he failed to return home the night before. At first glance, it appeared that Pastor Daniel had passed away quietly, perhaps succumbing to a heart attack or some other natural cause. His body was slumped over his desk, his Bible still open in front of him, as if he had been in the midst of deep prayer when death had claimed him. The scene was almost peaceful, as if he had simply drifted away in his sleep. But the peace was short-lived. As the initial shock of his death began to wear off, so details started to raise questions. The position of his body, the look of strain on his face, and a slight discoloration around his lips suggested that perhaps this was not as natural a death as it first appeared. Whispers of suspicion began to circulate, and it wasn't long before the local police were called to investigate. The townspeople, still reeling from the news of their pastor's sudden death, were plunged into a state of uncertainty. What had initially seemed like a tragic but straightforward loss was now becoming something much more troubling. As the police began their investigation, they quickly uncovered a series of text messages exchanged between Pastor Daniel and the two young men he had been mentoring so closely, Ethan and Lucas. The messages were cryptic, filled with personal confessions, emotional pleas, and hints of conflict. It became clear that the relationship between the pastor and the young men was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The discovery of these messages sent shockwaves through the community. The image of Pastor Daniel as a faultless spiritual leader began to crack, revealing a side of him that no one had suspected. The content of the messages suggested that the relationship between Pastor Daniel, Ethan, and Lucas had been strained in the weeks leading up to his death. There were hints of jealousy, unspoken tensions, and a growing distance that seemed to be tearing them apart. For a community that had always viewed Pastor Daniel as a pillar of moral integrity, these revelations were almost too much to bear. Opinions quickly became divided. Some members of the congregation refused to believe that their beloved pastor could have been involved in anything inappropriate, clinging to the belief that he had been a victim of some tragic misunderstanding. Others, however, began to wonder if there was more to the story, if perhaps the pastor had been leading a double life that had finally caught up with him. Ethan, when brought in for questioning, displayed behavior that only added to the growing sense of unease. He was visibly nervous, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a jittery, anxious energy. He spoke in fragmented sentences, often trailing off into silence, as if struggling to find the right words. At times, he seemed on the verge of tears, only to abruptly shift into defensive anger. His emotional volatility raised red flags for the investigators, who began to suspect that Ethan knew more than he was letting on. Lucas, in contrast, was calmer, though clearly shaken. He maintained that he had nothing to do with the pastor's death, and that the messages were being taken out of context. But his pale complexion and the way he avoided direct eye contact suggested that he, too, was hiding something. The police, sensing that the truth was buried deep within the complicated dynamics between these three men, decided to dig further. They seized the cell phones and computers of both Ethan and Lucas, combing through them for any clues that might shed light on what had really happened. What they found was a digital trail that painted a picture of growing rivalry and resentment. Ethan and Lucas, once close friends, had become increasingly competitive, each vying for Pastor Daniel's approval and attention. The messages revealed a pattern of subtle manipulation, passive-aggressive comments, and mounting frustration. Ethan, in particular, seemed to be struggling with feelings of inadequacy, lashing out in ways that suggested he was desperate to maintain his place in the pastor's inner circle. As the details of the investigation began to emerge, the town's once unified congregation found itself bitterly divided. Some people, loyal to Pastor Daniel's memory, insisted that the young men were fabricating stories to cover up their own guilt. They refused to believe that their pastor, who had done so much good for the community, could be involved in anything untoward. Others, however, were swayed by the evidence, believing that the messages hinted at a dark undercurrent that had been festering beneath the surface. The community, which had always prided itself on its unity and shared values, was now being torn apart by doubt and mistrust. The church, once a place of solace and refuge, became a battleground of conflicting emotions. People whispered in the pews, exchanged knowing glances during services, and avoided eye contact with those on the opposing side of the debate. The tension was palpable, seeping into every corner of the town. Friends became distant, families were split down the middle, and the once harmonious community was now fractured by suspicion and fear. The more the investigation uncovered, the deeper the divide grew. The scandal surrounding Pastor Daniel's death was no longer just a matter of personal tragedy. It was a crisis that threatened to destroy the very fabric of the town. As the police continued their work, the town held its breath, waiting for the truth to finally come to light. But with each new piece of evidence, the mystery only seemed to deepen, leaving everyone to wonder. What really happened to Pastor Daniel Brooks, and what secrets had he taken to his grave? The answers, when they finally came, would not only reveal the truth behind his death, but would also force the community to confront the shadows that had been lurking in their midst all along. The investigation into Pastor Daniel Brooks's death took a dramatic and chilling turn when the results of the autopsy were finally revealed. What had initially been assumed to be a natural death, perhaps a heart attack or stroke, was now exposed as something far more sinister. The coroner's report concluded that Daniel Brooks had not died of natural causes, but had been poisoned. The revelation sent shockwaves through the town, transforming a case of tragic loss into one of deliberate and calculated malice. The peaceful community that had once looked up to Pastor Daniel as a beacon of moral integrity was now faced with the horrifying reality that someone among them had wanted him dead. With the autopsy report in hand, the police immediately reclassified the case as a potential homicide, driven by motives of revenge or jealousy. The investigation intensified, and the once sympathetic and concerned detectives now shifted their focus to uncovering the identity of the person responsible for this heinous act. Every detail, every conversation, every piece of evidence was scrutinized under this new, alarming light. The possibility that someone in the close-knit congregation had harbored such deep resentment against the pastor that they resorted to poisoning him was almost unthinkable. Yet it was now the grim reality they had to face. As the investigation progressed, a significant lead emerged that put one of the pastor's closest confidants under a cloud of suspicion. It was discovered that Ethan, the outgoing and charismatic young man who had been so closely mentored by Pastor Daniel, had purchased a toxic substance just a few weeks before the pastor's death. The transaction, documented in a local hardware store's records, showed that Ethan had bought a chemical known to be highly dangerous if ingested. This revelation cast a dark shadow over Ethan, raising serious questions about his involvement in the pastor's death. Why would a young man, known for his dedication to the church and his close relationship with the pastor, need such a substance? When confronted with this evidence, Ethan's demeanor changed. The nervous energy that had marked his earlier interrogations gave way to something more complex. He admitted to purchasing the substance, but insisted that it had nothing to do with the pastor. According to Ethan, he had bought the chemical for a harmless, albeit unusual, purpose. He claimed he was using it for a school experiment, something to do with chemistry that he had been interested in. But the explanation rang hollow, and the investigators were not convinced. The timing of the purchase, so close to the pastor's death, was too coincidental to ignore. Ethan's story was full of gaps, and his insistence on innocence only made the police more suspicious. Further pressure was applied, and Lucas, the other young man closely associated with Pastor Daniel, was brought back in for questioning. The investigators confronted him with Ethan's purchase of the toxic substance, and Lucas's reaction was telling. He initially tried to distance himself from the situation, claiming that he had no involvement and was unaware of Ethan's actions. However, under intense questioning, Lucas began to falter. He reluctantly admitted that he had known about the purchase, but like Ethan, he claimed to believe that it was for an innocent purpose. Lucas said that Ethan had mentioned something about a school project, and he hadn't thought much of it at the time. But Lucas's story was full of inconsistencies. His shifting accounts and the way he avoided eye contact during the interrogation suggested that there was more he wasn't saying. The investigators could sense that Lucas was hiding something, and their suspicions grew. Was Lucas protecting Ethan out of loyalty, or was he himself involved in a deeper conspiracy? The more Lucas tried to explain, the more tangled his story became, leading the police to believe that the young man was far more knowledgeable about the circumstances surrounding the pastor's death than he was letting on. Ethan, too, found himself under increasing pressure as the investigation closed in on the truth. Despite his initial denials, he eventually admitted that he had known the substance was toxic and that it had the potential to cause harm. However, he continued to insist that he had never intended to use it against Pastor Daniel. According to Ethan, he had bought the chemical on a whim, without any real plan or malicious intent. But this explanation did little to clear his name. In fact, it only deepened the investigators' suspicions, especially when new evidence surfaced that hinted at a possible motive. It was revealed that Ethan had been feeling increasingly marginalized by Pastor Daniel in the weeks leading up to his death. The pastor's growing closeness with Lucas had apparently triggered feelings of jealousy and resentment in Ethan, who felt that he was being pushed aside. This emotional turmoil, combined with a toxic substance in his possession, painted a picture of a young man who might have been desperate enough to do something drastic. The investigators began to consider the possibility that Ethan, driven by jealousy and a sense of betrayal, might have seen poisoning the pastor as a way to reclaim his place in the church's inner circle, or perhaps as an act of revenge for what he perceived as a personal slight. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when a member of the church, previously too afraid to speak up, came forward with a crucial piece of testimony. This witness, a quiet and unassuming individual who had been present at the church on the day of Pastor Daniel's death, reported seeing Ethan and Lucas in a heated argument just hours before the pastor was found dead. According to the witness, the argument had taken place in the very hallways of the church, with both young men visibly agitated and upset. The exact content of their argument wasn't clear, but the witness recalled that it had something to do with Pastor Daniel, and that both Ethan and Lucas had seemed deeply troubled. This testimony was a tipping point for the investigation. The sighting of the two young men arguing, coupled with the discovery of the toxic substance and the conflicting stories told by Ethan and Lucas, led the police to conclude that the death of Pastor Daniel Brooks was no accident. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, pointing towards a tragic tale of jealousy, betrayal, and a desperate attempt to resolve a conflict that had spiraled out of control. The once peaceful town was now facing the undeniable truth that the people they had trusted most had been hiding secrets that would forever change the course of their lives. The atmosphere in the small town had become thick with anxiety and suspicion as the investigation into Pastor Daniel Brooks's death reached its boiling point. The once unshakable community, bound together by faith and shared values, was now fractured, each day bringing new rumors and doubts. The final straw came when both Ethan and Lucas, the two young men at the center of the investigation, were arrested and taken into custody. The police, having pieced together a compelling but incomplete narrative from the scattered evidence, knew that they were on the brink of uncovering the full truth. Yet, the story was still shrouded in uncertainty, and the arrest sent a shockwave through the town, leaving everyone grappling with the horrifying possibility that the pastor's death was no tragic accident, but a calculated act of betrayal. As Ethan and Lucas were placed in separate holding cells, the tension that had been simmering between them finally erupted. The weight of their secrets, the lies they had told, and the guilt they had tried to suppress had become too much to bear. Lucas, the quieter and more introspective of the two, was the first to break. In a moment of overwhelming guilt and despair, he confessed to the police that he had known about Ethan's plan to poison the pastor. His voice trembled as he recounted the moment when Ethan, filled with anger and hurt, had revealed his intention to teach the pastor a lesson. Lucas had been horrified, but fear and loyalty had kept him silent. He had been terrified of losing Ethan's friendship, and even more so, the respect and affection he had earned from Pastor Daniel. The thought of being cast out, of being seen as a traitor, had paralyzed him into inaction. Lucas's confession was a devastating blow to the investigation and to the image of the young man who had always seemed so morally upright. His admission painted a picture of a deeply conflicted soul, torn between his conscience and his desire to belong. He had known that what Ethan was planning was wrong, but he had convinced himself that Ethan would never go through with it, that it was just talk. By the time he realized how serious Ethan was, it was too late. The guilt that had been gnawing at him since the pastor's death now came crashing down, and Lucas could no longer bear the weight of his complicity. Ethan, on the other hand, was not as easily broken. When confronted with Lucas's confession, he lashed out in desperation, his calm facade crumbling as the reality of his situation set in. He tried to justify his actions, claiming that he had been driven to the brink by feelings of abandonment and betrayal. Ethan explained that he had idolized Pastor Daniel, seen him as a father figure, and placed him on a pedestal. But when he discovered that the pastor had been spending more time with Lucas, sharing private moments and confiding in him, Ethan felt as though his world was falling apart. The pastor, who had always been his guiding light, suddenly seemed distant, and Ethan's mind filled with dark thoughts of jealousy and resentment. In a moment of vulnerability, Ethan admitted that the decision to poison the pastor was born out of this emotional turmoil. He had wanted to regain the pastor's attention, to make him realize how much he had hurt him by favoring Lucas. But as he spoke, the justification rang hollow, even to his own ears. What he had done was irreversible, and no amount of reasoning could change the fact that he had taken a life. The desperate attempt to paint himself as a victim only served to deepen the tragedy, highlighting the extent to which Ethan had lost his way. The trial that followed was a spectacle that the town had never seen before. The courtroom was packed with townspeople, all eager to witness the proceedings that would finally bring the truth to light. The prosecution presented a compelling case, laying out the timeline of events, the purchase of the toxic substance, and the damning confessions. But it was the new evidence that truly stunned the courtroom into silence. A letter written by Pastor Daniel himself, discovered in the pages of his Bible just days before the trial began. In the letter, Pastor Daniel expressed his deep regret over the situation that had unfolded between Ethan and Lucas. He acknowledged that he had unintentionally created a destructive dynamic by becoming too emotionally involved with the two young men, leading them to compete for his affection and approval. The pastor wrote of his guilt and sorrow, recognizing too late that his actions had set the stage for the tragedy that followed. He had planned to confront the situation, to set things right, but fate had intervened before he had the chance. The revelation of the letter added a layer of complexity to the case. It showed that Pastor Daniel, while not directly responsible for his own death, had played a role in the emotional turmoil that had driven Ethan to commit such a desperate act. The townspeople, who had once seen the pastor as an infallible figure, were now forced to reconcile their admiration for him with the knowledge that he too had made mistakes. In the end, the jury delivered its verdict. Ethan was found guilty of homicide, his actions deemed a tragic but clear-cut case of premeditated murder. The evidence, combined with his own confession, left little room for doubt. Lucas, while not the one who administered the poison, was found guilty of being an accessory to the crime. His failure to act, his knowledge of the plan, and his silence in the face of Ethan's intentions were enough to make him complicit in the pastor's death. The judge's words were somber as he delivered the sentences, emphasizing the gravity of the choices that had led to this tragic outcome. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the trial, a heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The town, once united in its love for Pastor Daniel, was now left to grapple with the aftermath of his death. The scandal had torn the community apart, revealing the hidden fractures that had always existed beneath the surface. Ethan and Lucas, once bright young stars in the church's congregation, were now symbols of the dangers of unchecked emotions and the devastating consequences of a single, irreversible choice. The story of Pastor Daniel Brooks, Ethan, and Lucas would be remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the destructive power of jealousy and betrayal. And as the town began the slow process of healing, the lessons learned from this tragedy would linger, a permanent reminder of the dark shadows that can exist even in the most seemingly perfect of places. The trial of Ethan and Lucas had come to a close, but the wounds it left in the small town were far from healed. The church, once a beacon of unity and moral guidance, now stood as a stark reminder of the scandal that had torn the community apart. The congregation that had gathered every Sunday with unwavering faith was now fractured, with many members questioning the very foundation of their beliefs. Attendance at services dwindled as people, disillusioned and heartbroken, chose to distance themselves from the place that had once been a source of comfort and strength. The church, which had been the heart of the community, now echoed with emptiness and uncertainty. The leadership of the church came under intense scrutiny. Pastor Daniel Brooks had been a towering figure, and his tragic downfall left a void that no one seemed able to fill. The elders of the church, who had once stood confidently beside Daniel, now found themselves at a loss, unsure of how to guide a congregation that had lost its faith not just in their pastor, but in the very institution of the church itself. Whispers of doubt and mistrust spread like wildfire, with some members openly questioning whether the church could ever recover from the scandal that had rocked its foundation. Amid this turmoil, Sarah Brooks, the widow of the late pastor, faced her own personal battle. The man she had loved and supported for so many years was gone, and in his place, she was left with a legacy tarnished by betrayal and scandal. Sarah had always been a pillar of strength, known for her kindness and devotion, but now she found herself grappling with a pain that was almost too much to bear. The public scrutiny, the whispers behind her back, and the knowledge of her husband's role in the events that had unfolded weighed heavily on her. Yet, despite the overwhelming grief and the shame that threatened to consume her, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. Determined not to be defined by the tragedy that had befallen her, Sarah chose to leave the town that had been her home for so many years. The memories of her life with Daniel were too painful to endure in a place where every corner reminded her of what she had lost. She decided to move away, to start anew in a place where she could rebuild her life without the shadow of the past hanging over her. It was not an easy decision, but it was one that Sarah knew she had to make in order to heal. As she packed her belongings and said her final goodbyes to the town she had once loved, Sarah felt a sense of resolve. She would carry the lessons of her past with her, but she would not let them define her future. Meanwhile, Ethan and Lucas, now confined to prison, were left to face the harsh reality of their actions. The weight of their guilt pressed down on them like a heavy burden. As they came to terms with the lives they had destroyed, including their own, Ethan, once full of youthful energy and ambition, now spent his days in quiet reflection, haunted by the choices that had led him to this point. He had been driven by emotions he barely understood, his sense of betrayal and jealousy blinding him to the consequences of his actions. Now, in the solitude of his cell, he had nothing but time to reflect on the irreversible damage he had caused. Lucas, too, struggled with the enormity of his guilt. He had known what Ethan was planning, and yet, out of fear and loyalty, he had done nothing to stop it. His inaction had made him complicit in the pastor's death, and the realization of this weighed heavily on his conscience. The bond that had once existed between the two young men was now broken, replaced by a bitter understanding of how their choices had led them down a path of destruction. In their moments of solitude, both Ethan and Lucas were forced to confront the truth. They had been consumed by their own desires and had allowed those desires to destroy the lives of those around them. As the town continued to reel from the scandal, the community slowly began the process of rebuilding. The shock and betrayal that had torn them apart also served as a catalyst for change. The remaining members of the congregation, those who had chosen to stay, recognized the need for new leadership, for a fresh start that could help them move past the darkness that had enveloped their church. The elders, though shaken, began to take steps toward restoring the congregation's faith. They reached out to the community, acknowledging the mistakes of the past and pledging to guide the church with greater transparency and accountability. In time, a new generation of leaders emerged within the church. These individuals, deeply aware of the errors that had led to the scandal, were determined to build a church that was more inclusive, more open, and more attuned to the needs of its members. They understood the importance of fostering genuine relationships within the congregation, relationships built on trust and mutual respect rather than on power dynamics or hidden agendas. This new leadership brought a sense of hope and renewal to the church, signaling the start of a new chapter for the community. As the years passed, the story of Pastor Daniel Brooks, Ethan, and Lucas became a part of the town's history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked emotions, hidden relationships, and the destructive power of jealousy. The lessons learned from the tragedy were not easily forgotten, serving as a reminder of the need for honesty, transparency, and compassion in all aspects of life. The church, once a symbol of scandal and betrayal, gradually regained its place as a center of community and spiritual guidance, albeit with a renewed sense of humility and purpose. In the end, the case of Pastor Daniel Brooks was not just a story of a tragic death. It was a story of a community's resilience, of its ability to confront its darkest moments and emerge stronger, wiser, and more united. The scars of the past remained, but they were now part of a larger tapestry of growth and redemption. The town had been tested in ways it could never have anticipated, but through the pain and the struggle, it had found a path forward, a path that honored the lessons of the past while embracing the promise of the future. The death of Pastor Daniel Brooks was more than a tragedy. It was a revelation that tore through the very fabric of a once innocent community. His passing exposed the fragile nature of the human soul, laying bare the dangerous consequences that arise when secrets fester behind the comforting facade of faith. In a town that had long prided itself on its moral integrity and close-knit relationships, the scandal that unfolded was a stark reminder that even the most revered institutions and individuals are not immune to the darker impulses of the human heart. As the town struggled to come to terms with the events that had transpired, it became clear that the impact of Pastor Daniel's death would be felt for years to come. The man who had once been seen as a pillar of virtue, a beacon of light in a world often clouded by doubt and uncertainty, was now remembered with a mix of reverence and sorrow. The community was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that their faith had been placed not just in a man, but in an idealized version of him, one that was ultimately flawed, just as all human beings are. The trial and the subsequent revelations about Ethan and Lucas had peeled away the layers of trust that had once held the community together. In their place was a sobering realization. The dynamics of power, faith, and desire are far more complex and perilous than anyone had imagined. The relationships that had once seemed so pure and unassailable were now understood to be fraught with tension and unspoken conflicts. The pastor's role as a spiritual leader had become entangled with personal affections, leading to a tragic outcome that no one could have foreseen but perhaps should have guarded against. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. Ethan was convicted of homicide, and Lucas was held accountable for his complicity. The law had done its part, ensuring that those who had acted out of jealousy, anger, and fear were punished accordingly. But legal justice could only do so much. The real challenge lay in the community's ability to heal from the psychological and emotional wounds that had been inflicted, the trust that had been shattered, the friendships that had been strained, and the faith that had been questioned would take far longer to mend, if they could ever truly be repaired at all. The once thriving church, which had been the heart of the community, now stood as a monument to both the power and the peril of faith. It had been a place where people sought solace, guidance, and a sense of belonging, yet it had also been the stage for a drama of human weakness and moral failing. The lessons learned from this tragedy were harsh but necessary. The intertwining of power, faith, and personal desire can lead to a dangerous brew, one that, if left unchecked, can poison even the most well-intentioned souls. As word of the scandal spread beyond the town, other communities watched with a mixture of shock and introspection. The story of Pastor Daniel Brooks became a cautionary tale, a narrative that was repeated in hushed tones in churches, community centers, and homes across the region. It served as a warning about the dangers of placing too much power in the hands of a single individual, no matter how righteous or well-meaning they might seem. It also highlighted the importance of transparency, accountability, and the need to maintain healthy boundaries in all relationships, especially those built on trust and faith. For those who had lived through the events, the lessons were etched into their memories with painful clarity. They had seen firsthand how easily faith could be twisted, how quickly admiration could turn to obsession, and how devastating the consequences of unchecked desire could be. The community, once so certain of its moral compass, had been forced to reevaluate everything it thought it knew about right and wrong, about trust and betrayal, about love and loss. In the end, the town did begin to rebuild, but it would never be the same. The church eventually reopened its doors under new leadership, with a renewed focus on humility, honesty, and inclusivity. The scars left by the scandal, however, remained visible, a constant reminder of the past and the lessons learned. The members of the community moved forward, but they did so with a greater awareness of the complexities of human nature and the need to remain vigilant against the darker impulses that can arise even in the most seemingly righteous of places. The death of Pastor Daniel Brooks, while tragic, served as a pivotal moment of reckoning. It exposed the vulnerabilities that exist within all of us and the dangers of ignoring them. The case became a touchstone for discussions about the role of power in religious institutions, the importance of ethical leadership, and the risks of allowing personal desires to influence positions of authority. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the borders of the town, resonating with anyone who has ever placed their faith in another person, only to be confronted with the fallibility that lies beneath. As the years passed, the story of Pastor Daniel, Ethan, and Lucas became part of the town's history, a chapter that was both painful and instructive. It was a story that would be told and retold, not just as a warning, but as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the darkness that had descended upon the community, the people had found a way to move forward, to learn from their mistakes, and to build something new from the ashes of the past. The town, like its church, would never forget what had happened, but in time, it found a way to honor the memory of Pastor Daniel Brooks, not just as a man who had fallen from grace, but as a symbol of the complexities of faith and the enduring quest for redemption. The lessons learned from his life and death would continue to guide the community, serving as a reminder that while faith can inspire great good, it must always be tempered with humility, honesty, and a clear-eyed understanding of our own human frailties.